Hello, my name's Marianne Richards, and this is the second video about my research project, which has been made after the project's completed. The first one was made when the project was started. Makes sense? So the first section is called Getting It Together. Right, here we go. Choice of subject matter. Now, I'm 55 years old, don't like to admit it, but I am. I'm also autistic. I have Asperger's syndrome, which is on the edge of the spectrum, but nonetheless makes life difficult. Because of that disability, I found coming as a new student at my age quite a daunting experience at first, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later as we go along. The first thing we had to do when we entered the fourth year was to decide upon our subject matter. And my subject matter was, the initial title was called A Study of Coping Strategies Among Informal Carers of Depressed Relatives. Now, when I first started out, what I wanted to do was a study called The Correlation Between Hope and Recovery in Depressive Illness, but I was actually told that was a PhD level topic. It would take several years and a lot of funding. So that just goes to show you how difficult it is just to get the title part right. When you say the title, it sounds very glib, and you've got absolutely no idea if it's right, if it's going to be logistically feasible. So you do have to listen to your tutors on that. So after much thought and much talking to tutors, and something like 3 months later, would you believe, I'd come up with this title, A Study of Coping Strategies Among Carers of Depressed Relatives. So how do you start? I'd got no idea how you started. The first thing was to read up on research, because at university, unlike school, I found that you are left on your own quite a lot of the time. So understanding research, I got an understanding through going to the library at the University of Bath and chatting with the librarians. In itself, that was difficult because the library in Bath is enormous, a glass building 5 stories high. I come from a working class background, and I come from a town called Coventry, an industrial town, and the main central library there is quite small, smaller than the building I'm standing in, and is only 1 story high. So you can imagine how overwhelmed I felt when I went to this amazing library. But I was amazed to find that all the librarians were so helpful, and that you could actually have one-to-one sessions with them, and they'd teach you about how to use the databases. I mean, this just blew my mind when I started. So having got a little bit under my belt about the types of research possible, and obviously having referred back to my supervisor and my tutor, the next thing was to make the research plan. Now, I'm going to read my notes here, because as you get older, you do need these glasses. It completely changed. At first, I was going to do my research through questionnaires rather than interviews, because I was rather afraid of the idea of interviewing people. Towards the end of the research, it actually changed, because after having talked to a lot of people, they said the sort of research I wanted to do, qualitative research, which is to do with people and words, is much easier to do through interviews than questionnaires. If you get the words wrong on the questionnaire, if people don't understand what you've written on the questionnaire, then it's very much more difficult to get the type of information you need to do the research. So I took on board what they said and changed my plan. In fact, it changed several times, as you'll probably find when you do yours. I did have an awful lot of help from experts. Now, again, that was very difficult for me because I'm not very good socially, as I say, and it took a lot of practice for me to pluck up the courage to actually go and ask these people. But when I did, I was amazed at how caring they were and how interested they were in my project, me, a mere student, and some of them were quite famous in their field. But I didn't find one person, in fact there's probably just one who wasn't so helpful, but all the rest of them were so amazingly helpful that it made the research project a really nice thing to do. I think the last thing I want to say in this section of getting it together is that it is so important to keep a log trail of everything you do. Keep a diary, keep a list of the books. I used a package here which is called Reference Manager. Keep a record of the protocols you use, in other words, a set of directives which you yourself write, which tells you how you're going to go about the research, what you're going to do every day, and then at the end of the day what you've actually achieved, because I'd find that maybe coming back to it a few days later after having intervening work and being really out of being a student, it was very difficult for me to keep a track. And then books and papers would arrive from the library and I got no idea what I wanted them for. That was a real problem at first. As soon as I started keeping this log trail and this set of protocols, it became easy. And then of course at the end of the project it was far easier to backtrack. So I think that's that section. The second section is called Nitty Gritty. You see these magnificent handheld things here. Things are not always as they seem. I want to demonstrate that. Okay, tar-covered boot. All right. I wondered how many of you were thinking I got a suit on underneath here and I was all suited and booted. No. You might think, well, what's that all about? And you might think, oh, she's a bit eccentric. But the truth of the matter is I live on a houseboat, and in order to get here today, I had to come across the yard, which was very wet and very muddy. So I wear these shoes because obviously you get covered in tar and all bits and pieces. But unless you'd known that, you might have thought, oh, well, she sounds rather strange. You know, 1 minute she's talking about being a student and the next minute she's showing us this tarry shoe. It just goes to show things are not what they seem. You know, what lies beneath is not always what's on the surface. And I certainly found this when I started my research project. You make assumptions about things, how they're going to work. And the first thing where things started to go a bit awry was recruits. I thought I was going to recruit from among carer groups. I thought I'd just go to carer leads and say to them, I would like to talk to carers of people with depression. So I did that. I went to 11 groups. And out of the 11 groups, only 2 actual people were identified who were carers of someone with depressive illness. And those 2 didn't want to be interviewed. I mean, that was an absolute disaster. You can imagine. Here was I, several months into the project, got everything planned, all my protocols written up, everything going hunky-dory, and then suddenly I got no one to talk to, no interviewees. Absolute disaster, you might think. Or is it? I'll come to talk about that later. But luckily, I met a doctor who very kindly said to me, oh, I think I know 1 or 2 people who might be useful. And then through a process of talking to other people and getting ethics permission to do that, I gradually found 6 recruits. And that was just enough. I mean, it could have been more, but for a first student project, they say don't get too many because you'll be overwhelmed with data. So 6 people was about enough. Then I went about the process of interviewing, actually interviewed them in their own homes, and I actually had a sort of list of questions that I took out, which really tied down what I wanted to talk about. Lo and behold, after halfway through the first interview, I could really tell the person didn't want to talk about my questions. They just wanted to tell me their story. I was so enthusiastic about the project, I found myself at first talking to them about the project, answering their questions rather than eliciting information. So that's another thing, I had to learn to be quiet, which is very difficult for me, and listen to what they were telling me. And in fact, I really found that I got far more information through listening than I did through having a list of questions in the end. Okay, if they went off track a little bit, I had to bring them back to the subject. But I found that really enlightening. And thereafter, in the interviews thereafter, I would let them tell their story and then just kind of keep them on track with just keeping these questions in my own mind. And that seemed to work very well. And in fact, it was a really enjoyable experience. I asked them afterwards, and all of them said that they'd really appreciated the opportunity to tell their story because they hadn't had that before. I mean, it brings up all sorts of questions. Why were these people not at carer groups? How is it they were unidentified? Why is it nobody had listened to them before? All these questions were so useful because they were answered by the research project itself. So you could say serendipity, really, that what I thought was going to be an absolute disaster, in fact, turned out to be rich and give me far more information than I'd thought about in the first place. And to talk a bit about data analysis, I love computers. I think most people with autism do, but I love computers. And there was in the library in the University of Bath a piece of software called Navivo 7. Now, Navivo 7 doesn't analyse statistics, it analyses words and phrases, so that was perfect for me. It was very intuitive to learn, it was quite easy, and the best thing about it is you can keep all elements of your project in there, so you can keep all your transcripts, your diaries, your notes on the project, the memos, and of course the analysis of the data, and you can make live models from the data so that you know the analytical models that you're making will actually are matching the data because they've been drawn in from the raw data. It sounds a bit Greek until you actually come to do it, but if you try it, you'll find it's far more easier than you think. And I'm now very, very enthusiastic about using software for qualitative analysis. So I think that's about the end of that section. My next section is called After Analysis. After analysis, what happens? You've got your findings. Findings when expected. You may remember a little while ago I talked about the recruits. They weren't where I'd expected them to be at all. They were not in carer groups. That asked the question, why were they not there? Even the carer leads said they were quite surprised by that. They hadn't thought about it before. The carer groups consisted of carers who had people whose relatives had major mental illness, schizophrenia, things like cancer, physical disabilities, but not depression. Why was that? During the process of analysis, I discovered it was for many reasons. One is that people don't always recognise themselves as carers. They are part of the family of this person and therefore they see them as their loved one, their relative. They don't think about themselves as a carer. So that was a really important factor in the research. Also, depression is very difficult to quantify. A lot of people don't think of depression as an illness, but they think of it as maybe a different, someone's very moody, that's just their character trait. Or maybe they don't realise that it can be considered an illness, disturbance in brain chemistry. There is a lot of controversy over whether depression actually exists as if it is a major mental illness, and certainly you'll find some doctors who don't accept that depression is an illness, but they believe it's something that's caused through social conditions. So again, that was a far more interesting piece of finding. Then if I'd just gone straight there and had got my interviewees, I might not even have thought about these things. So serendipity does play quite a large part in it. I want to talk a bit about writing up now. Now, I was told right at the beginning by my tutor to wet the page, to start straight away, right at the beginning of the project, just do notes. So I started putting little bullet points in. I made myself a list of contents, and I found that really, really helpful, because by the time I'd finished the research and the analysis, the writing up was actually a huge part of it. It took almost as long again as I'd taken so far over the project. This is something they tell you in the books, but when you come to experience, it's hard to believe, because you think writing how many pages, I think it's probably 50 pages, something like that, wouldn't take very long, but in fact it does. So I would say using the research log and writing a set of protocols for yourself, by doing those things and by keeping a record of all the books and the papers that you've got in the database, then it makes the writing of it far easier and far quicker. The language, I find the language tremendously difficult. I mean, people don't like to talk about class these days, but I wasn't brought up with all this academic language, and so it was quite frightening for me at first. I got used to it as I used it, and as I used it more, as I read about it in the papers, you know, the research papers that I'd gathered together from the library, and as I began to use that language myself, the way I got over it was just writing it as my supervisor suggested in my own language, and then sort of virtually translating it at the end into the proper academic language. It was no easy task, but I can tell you when I finished, it was just such a joyful experience to think that I'd actually written this thing. And the last thing really here is finishing off. Polishing the dissertation took several weeks. I had no idea it would take that long. Simple things like checking spelling, checking grammar, checking that the academic language was right, checking everything was in the right section, methodology was in methodology and not in results, and so on. And then checking the Harvard references at the end. It took me 3 days just to check the references over again. And I'm glad I did, because I found a lot of errors. I mean, just ordinary references like putting the page number in the book in and making sure that that page number was right. It's amazing what can go wrong like that if you don't check it up afterwards. It took, as I say, far longer. Even when I was in the print shop, I found that the table of contents, there were 3 errors in there, the page numbers were wrong, and there was an error in the title. And that was when I'd taken it down to the printers. But luckily everyone was very understanding, and I finished it. At this point in time now, we're at the end of July, I don't know if I've passed or not. I certainly hope I have. I put the dissertation in last month, and I think I get the results about September or October. What I can say is it's been a wonderful experience. It's been a marvellous experience of something that I never thought I could do. And I must say, during my life, a lot of people have given me that impression as well, that I wasn't able to do it. So here we are, prove them wrong. It doesn't matter in a way whether I pass or not. Obviously, I hope I have. But even if I don't, then it's a wonderful achievement. I feel a great sense that I've learnt about myself. I've learnt about making a degree, and I've learnt what I can do, that I've got all these social aspects about me that I didn't know I had. So it's all been a really very positive experience. And yeah, I think having finished it, I feel that kind of sense of relief and can't wait for the results. And I would certainly like to take part in more research in the future, more qualitative research, and perhaps ally that with the media qualifications I have and do some social documentaries. It's really changed my life. I mean, I have been working while I've been doing this at B&Q. I mean, how many people doing a master's in mental health are working at B&Q at the same time? I guess, I don't know, I guess there are not many. But it's been a good experience. I'm glad I've done it. I'm glad I've finished it. I hope I pass, and I'd certainly like to do more work in the future. And I think that's about it. Thank you.